Okay, so welcome to Who's Who in American History, sponsored by Willits Library. I'm excited that you're here today because it's wonderful when a group of people that love history get together and gives us something we can talk about that isn't our current event, the pandemic, right? So let's talk a little bit about history. Just a preview. What we did last time, we talked about founding fathers. This week, we're going to talk about women. Yay, good. And so a lot of times when we think of history, it's his story. Yeah. And so tonight we're going to switch that around. We're going to do her story a little bit. Just let's get some equal time here. And so the three women that we're going to talk about today are not up there. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Alice Paul, and Margaret Sanger. And so, but before we start talking about these women, because they're from such a long time ago, we have to kind of put the story in context. So let's talk first about what it was like at the time period when we're talking about. And so the earliest story we're going to share with you is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And she lived in a time where women had very few rights. If you want to be thankful for the rights you have, let's talk about what she had. So at the founding of the United States, and I'm talking too fast, and I'll try to slow down. At the founding of the United States, since it was mostly English common law was just adopted, and that became the norm. And one of those laws is something called coverture. Coverture is a doctrine that says a married woman's legal existence was tied to her husband. So in other words, she didn't have any independent legal existence of her own. So what did that mean? That means she couldn't sign a contract. Just in the same way you would never let a 7-year-old sign a contract, right? That's kind of the way they treated women. She could own no property. And I don't just mean land, I mean property. Anything that they owned was the husband's. And so therefore, if she left her husband, she could be arrested for stealing the clothes on her back, because they were not even hers. If she had a job, and remember, we like to think that women haven't worked until the 60s during the feminist movement. No, women have worked since the dawn of time. So women did have to work. If a woman had a job, her paycheck went to her husband, not her. And so this was the background to why these women we're going to talk about started questioning, why don't women have rights? And we're going to see some of their questions being linked to the same questions that the colonists had when they separated from Great Britain, because they argued that they didn't have what? Rights. Right? You're passing laws on us that we have no say. Taxes, right? You're making us pay taxes that we didn't get to vote for, so we want to separate and be our own. And so women are going to kind of use some of those doctrines to say, we don't have rights, okay? So it's really an interesting background to why women started questioning for their rights. So, and the last thing that women didn't have a right to, and this one gets me in the gut, anytime there was a divorce, regardless of the cause, the children always went to the husband. And so, as a woman, a lot of women couldn't divorce because they couldn't leave their children. So anyways, so let me introduce you to Elizabeth Cady Stanton. You might have heard of her before. I like talking about her. She's was from a middle-class family. She was born, I have the dates up there, 1815 to 1902.
Yeah.
Oh, it should be 1902. That's a typo, my fault. So the date up there is wrong. At least my notes are correct. So 1815 to 1902. She was actually educated. Her family thought education was important. And even beyond what a girl's education would be. Middle class and upper class girls were educated until a certain point, because they needed to be able to have interesting conversation with their husbands. They needed to cook and clean and raise the children, especially that raise the children part, because it was believed that an educated woman would raise her children to be better citizens for the new nation. And so, but in her family, when it went to upper mathematics is where they would stop. A girl doesn't need to know mathematics. She needs literature, she needs religion, she needs maybe a foreign language, but poetry, but certainly not mathematics. And Elizabeth wanted to learn mathematics, and the school wouldn't let her learn. And she had a very forward-thinking father, and so he hired her a tutor. Her mathematics education doesn't come into what she did for society, but it does come into that she was an intelligent woman and did not want to, not get something just because she was a woman. So, 2 stories influenced her life that I'll share with you. I'm sure many more, but 2 that I'm familiar with. One of them is her lawyer father had a client that came to the house distraught and in tears. She had lost her husband. And the law at the time said that a widow gets 1/3 of her husband's estate, and the oldest son gets the rest. And she was telling Elizabeth Cady Stanton's father, I can't live on 1/3 of the estate, I need more, this isn't right, this isn't fair. And he says, it's the law, there's nothing I can do about it. And she left crying. And Elizabeth said to her dad, why didn't you help this woman? She needed your help. And he showed her the law and the law books, and he said, this is the law, look right here, it says, when a man dies, his wife gets 1/3 of her estate to help her support herself, and then the son gets the rest. And so Elizabeth, being probably an ornery little girl, snuck in her father's law office and started tearing up the pages of her law book that weren't fair to women. I don't like this law, I don't like this law, and I don't like this. And the dad came in and said, no, this is not how we change laws. There are other law books. That's not going to help. So that's one thing that influenced her life, the fact that the laws weren't fair. As a child, the other story is, as a child, her only brother died. And she was trying to console her dad and hug him and tell him, that she was sorry. And he looked her in the eye and he said, oh, Elizabeth, if only you were a boy. And she said at that moment, her heart just sunk. And she realized there was nothing she could ever do that would please her father because she was just a woman. And so these are the things that kind of brought her about to who she was. And she did get married. She married a staunch abolitionist. At the time, the idea of slavery was being discussed. In the North, there was abolitionist groups where they'd meet and discuss how can we change this. And a couple things about her marriage that's interesting. Number one is you notice she kept her maiden name and added. So today, women do that all the time, hyphenate. But in this day, that was unusual. So Katie is her maiden name, Stanton's her married name. And in the wedding ceremony, when you have to promise to love, honor, and obey, she took that out. And so she had a very forward-thinking husband that was also comfortable with that. So they went on a honeymoon to London I have a picture. There we go. On a slow steamship, 2 months, however long it takes to get to London. And one of the things they were going to do while they were there was to attend an abolitionist meeting, because the world is talking about slavery, not just United States. And she and her husband had been working in the abolitionist cause, and they get there to the meeting, and they go to enter, and the organizers of the event won't let her in. You're a woman. Why do women, this is a business decision. And Garrison, who was a very prominent person in the abolition movement in America, said, hey, these women have their own organization in America, you've got to let them in. And there was also somebody there with her, Lucretia Mott was also there, and Lucretia Mott was also denied entrance. And so finally they decided to let the women come to the conference, with the caveat that they sit behind a curtain, so they wouldn't disrupt the meeting. Well, I'm sure they were fuming. And so these two women, very strong-minded women, sat, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, sat behind this curtain and said, you know what, this isn't fair. When we get home, we're going to start a women's rights movement. Well, by the time Elizabeth Cady Stanton was home, she was pregnant. And after 8 years, they get together and they finally start the first women's rights convention. And that's where we're going next. So some of her major contributions, and that's what I want to talk about. There's a lot more about her life that's interesting, but I just want to talk about some of these major contributions to history. Well, this is the first in 1848 in Seneca Falls. Did I get the year right on this one? Oh, I didn't even put a year. Good. 1848, Seneca Falls, New York. The two women, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, sit down in her kitchen and plan the first women's rights convention. It was attended by over 300 people, men and women, but of course mostly women. And it was a 2-day event, and they write what's called the Declaration of Sentiments. And this document kind of lines up what we want to come out of this convention. A list of the rights we want. And all the women were supposed to sign it. Well, she has this speech towards the end of the convention where she produces this document, and she writes this. And tell me if this sounds a little familiar to you. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one portion of the family of man to assume among people the earth, the position, blah, 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 blah. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. And they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, right? That's the Declaration of Independence. She's saying that the women need to be independent, right? And then there's a list of like 27 items that she thinks that women have been denied, and she lists them. And so she says he has never permitted her to exercise her inalienable right to elective franchise. And a lot of these lists, and I have a handout over there for you, take it, you can read the whole document. And in this document, she says, we need the right to vote. The reason being, the men that make the laws that are taking away our rights don't recognize that we're their constituents because we don't vote. And a lot of the women went, their mouths dropped and they went, oh, now you've gone too far. There's no way we should vote. That's weird. And again, some men that were at the meeting stood up and said, hey, you know what? You do need to vote. And convinced them that that was an achievable goal. And they signed the document, and this started the women's rights movement that went on the rest of Elizabeth's life. Unfortunately, she died before she ever saw women gain the right to vote. But she did fight for other rights as well. And so, how did these contributions change history? Well, she brought about the change that women could divorce and keep their own children, keep their own pay, and she managed to get laws changed that allowed them to own property. And so these are some changes that she did see. And so these may seem like small compared to the right to vote, but, keeping your children's not a small right? That's a big one. And as I said, though, she did not gain the right to vote. She never saw that. And you're probably very familiar with her working along with Susan B. Anthony. When they did get the law addressed to Congress, they called it the Susan B. Anthony Law because Susan B. Anthony worked tirelessly. Susan B. Anthony is famous for saying that she wouldn't get married because she didn't want to give her rights to anyone else. And so she stayed single. So, all right, so the next person I want to talk about is actually the next generation. After this group of women continued fighting for women's rights to vote, they were getting old and needing to retire, and so a new group, the next generation comes in and takes over. And so this is Alice Paul. No, it isn't. This is Alice Paul. She was born in 1885. She was born in a Quaker family, and if you're not familiar with the Quaker religion, the Quakers are very have a very equal society. It's a very egalitarian society. They believe that women should learn to read, women should be educated, And so she was born in a family that believed that. And so she went to college. She earned a biology degree. She earned an MA in sociology. She studied social work in England, and she earned a PhD in economics at the University of Pennsylvania. So a highly educated woman. And it amazes me that those degrees aren't related, that her scope of knowledge is very broad. While in England, she met Lucy Burns, and the two of them joined the women's suffrage movement in England. Again, just like we were together fighting to end slavery, we are now fighting at the same time to gain women the right to vote. And the movement in America under Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony was a very peaceful movement. And that's not bad. They were gathering petitions, they were writing letters, they were holding conventions. That's how they were fighting for the right to vote. Where in Great Britain, they were doing it a little more militaristically, disrupting meetings, demanding the right to vote. There may have been some rotten tomatoes involved, okay, just saying. Wasn't the prettiest thing. And so they were influenced by this. And so striking and getting more notice was important to her. And so when they came home, they joined the American Women's Suffrage Association. And, the older women that were in this organization were happy to get some young people to join them. They did have some disagreement on how to go about demanding change. But they allowed to have her come on and organize some things. And one of the things she did, one of her major contributions, is organizing a parade. Oh, this was supposed to be showing you what she was talking about Quakers. I missed the Quaker slide. Isn't that a beautiful farm? Okay. She organized a parade in Washington, D.C. on March 3rd. And I don't have the date. Oh, I'm horrible with dates. I'm probably the only history professor that say that the year doesn't matter, but it really does. It was at the same time that Woodrow Wilson was going to be arriving to D.C. for his inauguration the next day. And she did that because a lot of news people were going to be in town to film that, and she wanted the parade to get a lot of national attention. 8,000 women marched in this parade. And over, I have the number here, 500,000 people watched. So it got attention. That's what she wanted. And the crowd got a little violent, yelling at them. The rotten tomatoes are going that way now. You go back home where you belong, and shouting obscenities. And from some onlookers, they said that the police that were there supposedly to protect them, they just kind of backed away and let it happen. And so there was a scuffle, and some people got hurt, nothing major, but it very disruptive, and pictures of it made the newspaper. And the older generation that was running the organization said, "Look what you did, we got negative news." And she goes, "Yeah, look what I did. Our parade is in every newspaper in the whole nation." And so this parade really got him noticed. The other thing she organized was called the Silence Sentinels. These were women that picketed the White House. And their sign said, "You say liberty is a fundamental demand of human spirit. How long must women wait for their liberty?" And so the women are picketing with these beautifully made signs on fabric. And they're just silently, that's why they're called the Silent Sentinels, walking. And they did this for months, if not years. And when the World War I started, every time there had been a war, like the women were fighting for their right to vote when the Civil War started, and so they stopped arguing and said, we need to come together as a nation and help the Civil War effort. And so now that's what it assumes, that they're going to stop. And instead they just change their signage. You fight for rights of people over there, while half your population here doesn't have those rights. And so they continued. And they were kind of an embarrassment to the administration, having these women march up and down claiming that they should have some rights. And they found a reason to arrest them. And they were arrested for blocking traffic and went to a working prison. And they demanded to be treated as political prisoners and demanded for their rights. And so Alice Paul went on a hunger strike while in the prison. And they were treated horribly in the prison. For example, one night the warden told the guards to, and I quote, give them a lesson. And history calls this night the Night of Terror. They took their batons and they beat them. They threw one woman against her metal bed frame and cracked her head. One woman, they tied her to her wrist to a bar above her head where her toes were barely touching the ground and left her there all night. They beat these women up for doing what? Asking the right to vote, right? Right. And nobody is knowing what's going on with these women, but somehow word got out. And so while she was on her hunger strike, it started looking bad for the administration. And he said, you know, you can't let this woman die. That will really make us look bad. And so they did that thing where they put a tube down in your stomach and pour whatever food they blended up in a blender down her throat, which is a very painful experience. And so they kept her alive. She didn't die. She spent 7 months in jail. There was one woman that had a heart attack during that period. She didn't die, but they just let her lay on the floor until like the next morning. So anyways, the prison was horrible, and because of that, and that news getting out, Wilson agreed to sign for women's right to vote. But that didn't take care of it, right? And now it has, as an amendment to the Constitution, it has to be ratified by the states. So in 1918 is when Wilson announced his support. And it required 36 of the states to sign. And as you know, clearly you know the end of the story. It did pass, and they did finally gain the right to vote. And I have to believe it's women like this that worked that hard to gain the right, that never gave up. You know, it's one thing to write a letter and say, well, I tried. You know, that's not what they did. And in her case, I can't even imagine the pain she actually had to go through. So, okay, the last person on our list is now, wait, we've got the right to vote. Oh, the last thing that Lucy Paul did, I should have said, is that she is the she's the founder of the National Women's Party. So after we gained the right to vote, you would think she'd say, now I'm done, I'm going to retire. But no, now she's forming a political party that's made up of women. And she wrote the ERA, which is an Equal Rights Amendment. And I have that in the handout for you to see as well. Interestingly, though, it obviously didn't pass. It's like, okay, we give you the right to vote, now you want equal rights. And so she continued fighting for that her entire life. So let's just do our first quiz. When did ERA finally pass?
21?
No.
Oh, no, that's the
That's
vote.
it. That's when we got the right to vote. It passed in 20. Anybody?
Did it ever pass?
Very good, Nikki. It never did pass. We don't have an Equal Rights Amendment.
Oh,
No, we don't.
It did pass in the House and in the Congress, but it wasn't ratified, and that was in the 70s,
Right.
60s and 70s. It never did pass. So that's not a good end to that story. I better go to something more fun. Okay, so now we're moving on to the next person in our list. And I didn't want to forget that equal rights. I have my notes right in here. I can't believe I almost forgot that. All right. So the next person is Margaret Sanger. I actually planned this as being the last person we were going to talk about long before the Supreme Court changed the Roe v. Wade. And I really don't want to go there in this conversation, but I want to tell you a little bit about Margaret Sanger and what she did for women. And again, why she did what she did. So Margaret was the 6th of 11 children. She was Irish Catholic, raised in poverty, and her mother died when she was only 50 years old, and Margaret thought that it was because of all those many births. She saw her mother go through, all these, births. She was trained as a nurse and worked in obstetric. Say the word for me.
That's true.
What you guys said. She was a maternal nurse and worked in the maternity ward. And in this field, she noticed the relationship between poverty and uncontrolled fertility. In other words, women having a lot of babies. And that the women that were the poorest were having the most children. And the correlation between this, we know now, is because if you count on this as a birth control, it doesn't work. But women that stay home with their children breastfeed until they're about 2. Women that have to go back to work, and the poor had to go back to work within weeks of having their children, while an aunt or your mother took care of their children, their grandmother. And so they would ovulate sooner and within months be pregnant again. And so within a year, they're having another baby. And the same thing happens. Now grandma's watching 2 kids, and she's going back to work. The other thing as a side note is that they were putting children on these bottles that were made from milk that was raised in the inner city with food that was so poor that they had to add something to the milk to make it look white. They added chalk to it because these poor people needed to put the kids on bottles. So she looked around and saw these women continually having babies, going to work, working their fingers to the bone, and the conditions in the cities were horrid. They were poor, they couldn't get out of poverty, they could hardly feed the children they're having at home, and here they're having another child the next year. It had a high population density. They lived in apartments, sometimes crammed, 2 or 3 families. They had the school wasn't free. And so you couldn't send, if you were poor, you couldn't send your children to school, at least to be safe for the day. As you see the children sitting on the gutter, playing in a gutter next to a what? Oh, a dead horse. Imagine the living conditions. There was no indoor plumbing at the time. You used chamber pots, and where did you dump the chamber pots? Out the window. So that's where the children are playing during the day, on those streets, with open sewers. And so the infant death mortality rate, and that's the number of children that die before they turn a year, was extremely high. It was up to 30%. In some neighborhoods even higher than that. Let's get a perspective of what that's like. Today it's 0.54, so less than 0.5% versus 30%. So, and among Irish babies it was even higher. And so she thought that, and this is her major contributions, that women and girls should understand their bodies. This is a time when you don't talk about those things. It's not proper. And she thought, well, that's silly. We need to talk about that, and we need to talk about ways to control births, how many to have. And so she wrote a book called What Every Girl Should Know. I have some excerpts from that book in your handout, so you can take home and read that. And it was published in 1912. And it was still a little shocking that she wanted girls to understand the parts of their bodies and how it worked, and ways to prevent pregnancies. In 1914, she published a family limitation pamphlets explaining birth control. And since her husband was helping her with this, he was helping her get them ready. He was arrested under the Comstock law because he was mailing what was considered obscene material because it talked about birth control. Birth control wasn't legal. And so he was arrested. In 1940, she started a newsletter called The Women Rebel, which discussed various issues relating to women's hygiene, childbirth, and the negative consequence of having too many babies. Next page. The post office ended up charging her with violation of her violating the Comstock law, and in order to avoid trial, she went to England. She just left the United States. And while she was there, she looked around at how they handled health clinics and came back, and she opened the very first family planning clinic in 1918. She called it a woman's clinic or something like that. Not family planning is what it became later on. In 10 days, it was raided by the police. They sent in a woman police officer and found out what they were doing, that they were offering women birth control, and they shut it down, and they hauled her away and arrested her and told her that if you agree to never open another clinic, we'll let you go. And she said, I'm not going to promise that. And so she spent a month in jail because she wouldn't promise that. And so in 1921, she founded the American Birth Control League. And again, this didn't, it still was illegal while she was doing all this, but she brought about the conversation that shouldn't women have access to women's health products. And so it became Planned Parenthood. And she brought about the process that became the first birth control pill. And she created this environment where maybe we should teach our daughters about their bodies and receive sex education and try to understand that. So, all right. So those are the three women that I chose to highlight today that I think made a huge impact. And so for questions, and we want to stop the video for questions so we can talk freely. And so we're just going to talk